Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of PartnerTalk. My name is Paulo Guerra and today is my pleasure to receive Steve with ITI Group. We are here at AVEVA Enable 2025 in Berlin, and today we'll be talking a bit about the partnership, how ITI has been addressing the market, a little bit about Enable, as well as maybe finish some thoughts on AI. So Steve, welcome to PartnerTalk. I'm going to say a few words maybe about yourself, about ITI, a little background.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. So I'm Steve Taylor. I'm part of ITI Group, an Endorsed Systems Integrator based in the UK. And essentially, historically, we came into the whole AVEVA relationship as PI system specialists. And so for more than 20 years, we've been supporting customers across many different industries, primarily in and around using the PI system. So we do a lot in oil and gas, energy, nuclear, and we're trying to move out towards manufacturing and pharma, but effectively helping customers to solve problems for improving how their equipment functions. So,
okay, very nice. Very glad to have you here. I can definitely tell they're moving very quickly in the manufacturing. They were actually the first winners of AVEVA Games with actually the manufacturing group, right? The manufacturing challenge. So maybe you want to share a little bit the experience about participating on AVEVA Games, playing with new tools during that exercise with our audience here today.
Yeah, that was a really fun one for us actually, because I say normally from day to day we do a lot with oil and gas data and energy data, and that was the first time we really had the chance to play in the manufacturing space. So fortunately, another division of our company had access to a customer who volunteered some manufacturing data. And so we got the chance to play with that using the AVEVA Connect platform and see how much we really could do with it. So it was quite fascinating getting under the skin of a different sector, different technology, bringing it into the AVEVA ecosystem, really seeing what we could do with it. And so it was playing with a whole new set of tools. We'd never touched any of the new AVEVA tooling, the Connect visualization services, the advanced analytics, and just getting the support from yourself and the rest of the team in using those tools and finding ways to explore and do things with the data that we just couldn't do with the PI system. It's really, I think we valued the opportunity a lot.
Great. No, glad to hear that. And it was very exciting to be there and watch the finalists and then finally provide you guys the award for the first ever AVEVA Games or Hackathon back in 2024. Okay, so maybe now moving to a real award. Do you mind maybe sharing with us how, for example, you've been over the years helping some of our customers using our technology, share some of their challenges, some of the main trends that you see in the industry, and how, again, our tools with your domain expertise is helping those customers solve their day-to-day challenges?
Yeah, that's part of our kind of area of specialty, is providing engineers that just work directly with end customers to understand problems with the equipment and really get to the root of it all. One of my favorite projects a couple of years ago was a large-scale PI AF project. It was geared around detecting anomalies across the entire, it was an international oil and gas company. And they have assets all over the world and many different sites that have similarities and differences. And they were trying to do anomaly detection across the entire piece. And it was interesting because at first it was really hard. We spent a lot of time, a lot of effort trying to get the detection right, being able to build the models to do what they needed to do. And initially, there was a sense of, there's not really much value here. That we're putting a lot of effort into getting the initial proof of concept working, and will it actually prove valuable? And then, once we got through that proof of concept stage and began scaling it, from going from 1 pump to 5 to 10 to 50, suddenly the scale went through the roof, and the value. Suddenly we were detecting issues on platforms and equipment that we hadn't even conceptualized for the first round, And suddenly the customer was finding that they were getting an immense amount of value. I think in one example, in a 6-month period, they got a 50-fold return on investment of the amount they were spending on the team building the tools. They were getting 50 times as much back in saved production losses and downtime. And it's things like that where you persevere, you push through the technical challenge, and then eventually you see that the value just really hitting the road.
Very interesting. Thanks for sharing. Great story. And I think, again, like I said, that was even before the whole AI, the whole massive computing power that we have nowadays access. So glad to see what you guys will be doing next with our new tools that you are releasing to the market. Okay, so maybe talk a bit more about the partnership now. What are some of the main benefits that you see by being part of our network? Like I said, you are now kind of coming to the broader AVEVA group, maybe expanding the portfolio. So maybe can you share a little bit of our listeners? What are some of the main benefits that you're seeing there?
Sure. I mean, for us, we were kind of grandfathered into the AVEVA relationship. We've been working with OSIsoft previously through the PI system. And really from the very beginning, I think it's the relationships that make things work. And so building that with the AVEVA team has been fantastic. Just being able to have the direct access to the product specialists, being able to talk through how things really should work and what the challenges are, how to move forward from them. You're not just dealing with the man behind the curtain, as it were. And so being able to have such a close relationship with AVEVA that we can talk through the challenges and support our customers and being able to get the support that they need for challenges from day to day, I think that makes all the difference in having a successful business and being able to execute projects kind of faithfully year on year.
Absolutely, no, great insights. And again, for us, it's also a two-way street, right? We couldn't be where we are, where we achieve without having partners like yourself, our top partners where they're there, deploying the solution, supporting our customers. So I think for us, it's very critical. We see our Endorsed System Integrators as a critical piece on the success of AVEVA and our partners for sure. Okay, so maybe now moving a bit more to the technical side, maybe we're going to talk a bit about AVEVA Enable. So we're here again this week in Berlin for the 2025 EMEA edition. So can you share maybe with our listeners what are the main reasons why you're coming to AVEVA Enable, if that's your first time, and what you're seeing so far here?
Yeah, it's been our first time here, and it was from a position that we have always known about the PI system and a few adjacent products. We're becoming increasingly aware of the wider AVEVA ecosystem, whether it's Connect and AIM and many of the other products that they're strategically valuable for customers in our space. They help them to get more value out of the data, but they're products that I can say that I've not really had a lot of hands-on experience. Being able to come along, get hands-on experience with the products in the labs, being able to talk to some of the product managers and the people steering and guiding them, even being able to talk about potential projects and saying, would it make sense for this product to be used in that kind of way? It means that before you ever go down the line of actually committing to a project, you're able to get a better sense of really what do the products do and how do you get real kind of value for customers from them.
Great. Yeah, that's kind of exactly reasons why we decided to create this conference, really to create kind of this sharing opportunity, both for AVEVA to share with our customers, with our partners, pretty much our latest innovation, have hands-on experience with doing our labs, but also very important to receive the feedback, right? At the end of the day, you guys are the ones talking to the customers, hearing the trends in the market, and bringing all this back to us so we can continue improving our tools and our offers to the market. Perfect. Okay, maybe one quick one. How would you describe, if you had to describe AVEVA Enable in one word, how would you?
In one word, engaging. As the opportunity to engage directly with product managers and technical specialists and peers, and that's a key thing for us. It's not just something to go along and hear how things are going, but actually to interact and talk and get more detail out of it all.
Great. Okay, maybe last one to wrap up this short edition of PartnerTalk here. We are in a technical conference. I don't think we could close without talking about AI. So love to hear maybe some thoughts, your thoughts on AI. How do you see the customer's journey? What you're taking out of this event, back to your customers, back to your team. Maybe even give some thoughts back to AVEVA Games. I think you, during the finalists, during the presentation, you made some great points around the use of advanced analytics. Again, if you just want to share with our listeners overall idea on thoughts on AI and how you see that being applied to the industry.
Yeah, it's a fascinating moment to live in, really, because we're just a couple of years into this focused discussion around AI, where there are so many tools out there that we can access and deal with, and people are trying things, they're succeeding in some things and failing in other things, and helping customers to navigate that journey is really challenging, and everybody's wanting to be that company that succeeds first time and gets really directly to the value. It's where, to me, a lot of it boils back down to something that we call the digital maturity curve. It's something that we use at ITI Group, and I've seen from AVEVA yesterday as well. And it's where, in order to get all the way up the curve to the place where you can use AI and agents and machine learning, there is journey to travel. That you got to get a lot of things right in terms of connecting your data together, standardizing the data, being able to model it and work with it in predictable ways. And so that's effectively it. Before you can really make the rest of the journey up towards AI, you've got to get the foundations right. You can't build your house on the sand. And so getting the foundations right is the first step to a successful AI transition.
Very good. Perfect. Thanks so much, Steve, again, for attending AVEVA Enable and sitting today with me. Hope you all enjoyed this episode of PartnerTalk, and talk to you soon.